Hello and hi, and welcome back to the alleyway behind my local steers. That's right, we're going local for this restaurant because today's video is all about foraging, gathering, and human behavioral ecology. Welcome back, everyone. Very glad to see you, and let's get started. So, when talking about hunter-gatherers from the Paleolithic and after, folks usually have a pretty simplified view of how those roles were divided and how they were performed. But as with pretty much everything, there's an entire world of study into the topic that we can delve into, hence the existence of this video. Now, the concept of gathering is a very extensive one, and as I'm sure you know, it involves a fair bit more thought than the average Joe might expect. And one of the tools used by archaeologists and anthropologists to understand how real-life hunter-gatherer groups conducted this aspect of their lifestyle is with human behavioral ecology, which takes an economic model and applies it to these human behaviors. And to understand this economic model, we just have to start from one core understanding of the gathering way of life, a simple term called constrained optimization. Constrained optimization means that human groups tend to obtain as many calories as possible while spending as few as possible. Because we of course used to want to gain as many calories as possible back in the day before all these hoity-toity reliable supply chains and modern beauty standards came out. And we call it constrained instead of perfect optimization because, well, perfect optimization is impossible. But that doesn't mean a group of humans won't try to at least aim for the highest possible form of optimization they can achieve. And you know, that's really beautiful. Now, under this umbrella of constrained optimization are a few key concepts to explore and understand in order for us to see how that optimization comes about. And the first is marginal value. Here's an example. If you, poor hungry viewer that you are, eat a sausage, that's great for soothing your hunger. But eating 10 in one sitting, you're probably going to swing to the other side of the pendulum and start to feel sick. And if you, poor stressed viewer that you are, take a relaxing hot bath at the spa, it's going to have a diminishing return the more hours you spend in that pool of toasty warm water getting all soggy and prudy. All this is to say that in a standard survival situation, a person will spend energy to perform an action or obtain something only so long as that action or item has value for them equal or greater to their energy spent. Like spending energy points in a video game. This creates an economical mindset. Imagine, if you will, a single apple tree mid-fruiting season, and our little caveman. Everyone say welcome back, little caveman. Our little caveman will make the effort to reach up and pick apples from this tree, but only a limited number of them, 1 or 2 to eat immediately, and then maybe 3 or 4 to take with them for the near future. It wouldn't really make sense for them to strip the entire tree of every apple, even if they theoretically could, simply because it's impractical, it will be wasteful, and it's just not worth the effort. And linked to marginal value and our next key concept is opportunity cost. This is when switching activities or resources yields a greater objective or personal benefit for the same amount of work. For example, if you favor orange juice over sausages, you may choose to spend your energy points on getting that sugary juice over the processed meat sticks. You may also obtain more of a resource with less effort by being smart with your gathering process. Little caveman could, for instance, cut a single branch off that apple tree that would give him 5 apples, instead of picking them one by one. Or he could shake the entire tree to get a larger number of apples that will drop to the ground, since picking them up from there would then be easier than from the tree directly. It's all about the energy that you are willing to spend. The third concept is discounting. In practice, we humans assign a lower value to what we may obtain in the future compared to what we can obtain in the present. In Italian, there's an expression that translates to better an egg today than a hen tomorrow. And in English, we have something similar. A bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. Both emphasize the idea of prioritizing small current wins over uncertain but potentially greater future wins. Spending time and effort now to obtain something in the future is not always advantageous, as the future will always be a little bit too uncertain. If our little caveman, for example, is faced with the choice of gathering wild grains to eat today, or to leave it all to go to seed in the hopes that the harvest will be doubled next year, the first option should be the one that wins. Without today's harvest, he might starve, or a freak hailstorm or extended winter might destroy everything for next year, making his sacrifice today completely pointless. But while it might seem like discounting is only an endorsement for instant gratification, this practice definitely does not mean assigning absolutely zero value to future resources. Otherwise, there would be no point in smoking meat or gathering chestnuts for our little caveman to save and store. Hunter-gatherers of the past simply prioritized the present over the future, not out of short-sightedness, but because they recognized how unreasonable it was to act based on an uncertain future. Even modern folks today still have plenty of reasons to utilize the concept of discounting. Have you ever heard of the lipstick index? In this economy, you should have. And the last concept is risk-sensitive behavior. Every human activity carries a certain risk of failure, and groups living in nature always have to take this into account. You might not find any animals when you go hunting, or you might gather a lot of hazelnuts only to discover they're all mostly worm-eaten. Up until now, we've been talking about foraging as if it's an economic transaction. Spend calories and time to obtain more calories. Simple. But it's unfortunately more like the stock market. You risk an investment to gain more, and the higher the risk, the higher the reward has to be. Some prefer to spend a little and get a small return, while others take big risks for big returns. But the risk always has to be worth it in the eyes of those taking it. For example, if hunting a bison only succeeds once in every 5 attempts a group makes, that reward is still greater than all the energy spent on the 4 failed attempts. But climbing up a cliff to grab a few eagle eggs, that reward is far too small for its level of risk. This risk estimating mechanism also applies to modern gambling, except humans are really bad at estimating the actual odds of winning or losing. Unlike the odds of taking down a large animal, which is something a hunting group could reasonably expect to accomplish, the odds of winning the lottery are absolutely infinitesimal. Seriously, if you haven't ever played the lottery, don't start now. Even with that economic downturn we seem to be experiencing globally for some mysterious reason no one can really pin down, somebody stop me. These 4 premises serve to create models of food searching and settlement, but to utilize them fully in the way they were intended, we would also need something called a currency, because we of course must quantify effort and reward in this human behavioral economy, just like how money is quantified in our real one. But trying to define this currency, especially for the purposes of writing fiction, is a total mess. Simply because we would then need to define the quality of these calories and have a good understanding of the real-world groups that you would be hypothetically researching for this model. That is of course because this model was made with actual anthropological research in mind, but since we're just looking into this for the sake of writing and will building our own groups, we can just avoid the calculations for this video. Moving on, now that we've covered constrained optimization, we can use the principles we've covered to talk about foraging models, which are established terms that help modern scholars interpret the otherwise very complicated reality of human foraging by breaking them down into simple rules. One of the oldest and most widely used of these models is diet breadth, otherwise known as resource selection. This model starts with the idea that humans do not gather everything they find, but only what is desirable to gather, selecting only the best resources from their environment. That is, the ones with the highest nutritional value and the best taste. And so they will ignore the more inferior forageables, even if there are more of them. Modern hobbyist foragers often pass up a number of edible foodstuffs while traveling for the sake of finding the tastiest treasures of the woods. For example, mushrooms. Could little caveman just eat the fern fiddleheads from the field next to him? Yes, but that's a survival food. Now porcini, that's a living food. Your tastes may differ. But while there is a preference gatherers have that lead them to find their favorite or best tasting forageables, that preference of course has to be adjusted or put aside entirely depending on the scarcity or difficulty of finding a resource. If porcini mushrooms get rarer to find in an area, our little caveman is simply going to have to make do and switch to something like the parasol mushrooms, which he would have previously ignored. It makes sense, right? This model has reportedly been very useful in the field of archaeology already, as it identifies what would otherwise be invisible patterns. If an old farm storage area held significant traces of acorn processing, a research team could reasonably assume that the farm experienced a period of poor harvest, because acorns are a fallback food. And if they went to the mill next door and noticed a decrease in rye flour in favor of wheat flour, they could deduce that there was an improvement in the peasants' living conditions or agricultural techniques. This is because, as we all know, rye bread tastes bad and should only be eaten if there is no other alternative. Moving on, the second foraging model in this group focuses on territory over resources. For the sake of simplicity, a territory can be divided into a grid, and each square contains one or more food resources that decrease when humans settle on or nearby it. Imagine two bars that appear every time a group settles into a territory, one representing resources, which is always decreasing, and one representing effort, which is always increasing. Now, it's important to note that humans don't stick around until the resources bar empties out and the effort bar is at its max. That would be silly. Instead, when the two bars get close enough to align with each other is when it no longer becomes worthwhile to stick around, and the group moves. But critically, moving also requires energy, especially when our little caveman is just walking on his own 2 feet without access to cars, horses, or even the wheel. Therefore, if a group travels far, they will do so to reach a zone they can exploit for a long time, while a group that travels in short spurts will stay in areas not much more productive than the ones they left behind. And how do our nomads pick out those locations? Why, through habitat selection, of course, which is a variation of the territory over resources model. To understand habitat selection, we must understand that there are two definitions for space. We have patches and we have habitats. Patch is the name we can use for small areas that are exploited until movement is necessary, but habitats are entire regions. In habitats, we don't count how many resources a group can extract, but instead, how many people can live there. The characteristics of a habitat determine movement patterns, resource distribution, and availability over time. But the most important factor of all of these is the regeneration rate of resources. In patch models, regeneration is considered irrelevant, but in habitats, there is a natural balance between regeneration and consumption. But there is also a maximum resource ceiling that the habitat can contain, which will stay right where it is until the invention of agriculture will later raise those limits. Humans, like our little caveman and friends, will over time occupy a habitat, exploit it, and multiply, and eventually their consumption will surpass the habitat's ability for regeneration. And once it reaches that point, the group will have three options. Either find new ways to exploit the habitat, again a very limited option until the rise of agriculture, or move into a new habitat, or enter a food crisis that reduces their numbers to a more sustainable state. And the last model in the section is central place foraging, where instead of talking about human groups like uniformly spread numbers covering their entire patch or habitat uniformly, we acknowledge that in reality humans occupy a single point in these spaces. The group will choose a base, usually one near water and sheltered from as many elements as possible, from which they will leave and return to while foraging. And these movements require energy. So the further they go, the higher the value of the resource has to be, and so they will be less selective near the base and more selective as they move further away. For abundant but distant resources, the group may process them on site, for example, shelling shellfish or butchering carcasses to remove the heavier, more useless parts, the shells, the skulls, spines, and ribcages. Their home base can also move within the same environment. If two larger food sources existed in one territory, say lake fish here and mountain goats there, the group will settle closer to the more stable source and then move seasonally into the mountains in order to hunt and forage. But as with everything when it comes to studying humans, there are a lot of uncertainties and nuances that can be found even in these attempts to break foraging down into models and rules. You can't literally calculate energy in and energy out because we have to accept that each individual human and their culture will weigh these different variables differently, which makes reconstructing these models for extinct societies with no written records extremely difficult, if not outright impossible. That having been said, let's move on to... Let's take ourselves a bit out of the theoreticals of the last two sections and talk a bit more practically. These models are tools used by anthropologists and archaeologists, and are somewhat more clinical and removed from the many practices of indigenous peoples around the world. To truly understand how hunter-gatherers lived, you must live amongst them. Camping enthusiasts or survivalists are not the same as hunter-gatherers who live off the land in societies that can last thousands of years. But even with these limitations and understanding we have as modern peoples with such an extreme disconnect from this way of life, we can at least do our best to imagine a realistic society while using these models. Let's imagine, if you will, our little caveman is part of his hunter-gatherer group in late glacial Anatolia. Anatolia was a climatic refuge, meaning it was a particularly bountiful area where plants that usually don't survive in colder habitats can survive during the Ice Age. Given its unique abundance, the group of humans that lived within it likely followed a long residence pattern, meaning they would stay in one area for many years and would move very far when they finally relocated, putting them on the very far end of the habitat selection spectrum. Our little caveman, a young adult under 20, might have seen only one relocation in his whole life, or even none. In fact, in some extremely fringe cases, hunter-gatherer groups lived in the same place for over a century before moving on. Now, this particular group of late glacial Anatolians have settled in one of the usual convenient places, on the shores of a lake or river. But they have chosen to settle in a rocky, barren area, and while it would at first glance seem a bit counterproductive to do so, it was because they were keenly aware that settling on top of their resources would degrade them through presence alone, especially when it comes to long-term settlements. Of course, they still had to stay close enough to their food resources to reach them, and it falls to us to decide what exactly it was that they ate. Remember what we said earlier on constrained optimization. They won't gather everything edible, but will focus on foods that give the most calories for the least effort. In this hypothetical habitat of late glacial Anatolia, our hunter-gatherers had access to pine trees, hazels, oaks, and chestnut trees. All of these produce edible fruits, but wild pine nuts are much smaller and require more effort for fewer calories. Oaks produce many acorns, 5 to 10 kgs on average, even up to 20 in good years, but they require special processing and taste worse than the alternatives. Chestnuts produce 25 to 50 kgs of produce in good years, but are found in smaller areas than the oaks, and the trees are huge, spreading widely, and are hard to manage for the average adult. By managing, I mean they're difficult to harvest and prune, which would have been a practice performed by this group in order to promote the tree's health and yield. It's not quite gardening or a food forest yet, but it's an interesting movement in that direction. And hazel trees, by comparison, grow into much smaller fruit-bearing trees in smaller areas, making them much more desirable compared to the rest. Therefore, we can assume our little caveman's hunter-gatherer's selection ranking would go something like this. Hazelnuts at the top because they're great, chestnuts coming in second, gathered when hazelnuts are either depleted or consumed to the point that their marginal value drops, because at some point the group will get sick of eating all those hazelnuts. Acorns would come in at 3, used to supplement the first 2 should there be a poor yield that year, and pine nuts coming in dead last would not be seen as abundant or nutritious, but may be cracked open and eaten casually when found by individuals or children at play, which Vincent assured me he did himself as a child, so I have a primary source for human children eating whatever these things are. Nuts, as famously calorie-dense as they are, were this group's best choice for autumn staples. Then come some other edible plants, such as the humble mushroom, autumn fruits, herbs, honey, and edible roots. This group, throughout the season, chooses abundant resources that are seen as worth the effort, but not necessarily the most abundant, in accordance with our diet breadth model of foraging. Among mushrooms, they actively sought out those with the flavor and textures that they liked the best. For example, porcini, with their fleshier, better consistency, might have been sought after over saffron milkcaps or chanterelles, even if they're fewer in number than their competition. And truffles, though prized, are far too hard to find consistently and would only be eaten on very special occasions or when found by chance, depending on if the society also holds truffles to similar value that we do in our modern day. I don't know how they taste, so I can only assume they're either great or just rich people hype like caviar. Let us set the scene. It's deep into autumn, and a group carrying large wicker baskets visit the hazel trees, resting in their naturally formed grove. These gatherers set down their baskets and start work with the closest tree in reach, and then move outwards. Along the way, they find a sick hazel, and may take the time to uproot it and burn it to protect the others in the grove. Once they find a particularly richly laden tree, the adults stop to gather, while around them the elders and children, who can't handle that kind of laborious work, spread out around the surrounding area to look for mushrooms or visit the rowan, blackthorn or dog rose trees, eating the fruit they find on the spot or bringing it back to add to the smaller baskets. And most importantly, these nomads wouldn't stay all day doing this. They would work for a few hours, gather what they needed, and then return to their settlement, since their base camp is likely close enough to be only a short walk away from this essential food source. The rest of the day would be spent doing small tasks, social activities, or relaxing. In fact, this lifestyle is so far removed from what colonial Western Europeans used as the standard work ethic for daily life that when they encountered indigenous hunter-gatherers around the world, they often described them shamefully as lazy and idle. This harvesting process would be repeated throughout the tree's fruiting season, visiting nearby hazel groves or moving on to chestnuts once the richest hazels were depleted, all the while gathering other edible plants as they moved, the types varying depending on the tastes of the day. And once winter comes creeping into their habitat, the days grow even slower. The group may do small repairs on their shelters or tools and continue foraging on a smaller scale, occasionally visiting the hazels to remove suckers around it or cut away any signs of infection in the wood to increase the tree's productivity for next year. Again, this is not quite true arboriculture, specifically because this group did not plant the trees nor did they monitor their growth until they bore fruit. Once spring rolls around, bringing with it all sorts of new growth, things do change, but not by much. Many edible plants start to grow around them, but none with the caloric power of autumn's yield. As a result, their diet relies mainly on stored autumn leftovers. After all, hazelnuts can last almost a year in storage, and while chestnuts require some processing in the form of drying and smoking, the process is not complex, and we can assume that they would have had knowledge of it. Supplementing these leftovers and fresh foraging would be the regular habits of fishing and hunting, while the elders and children wander idly outside of the settlement, never more than about a half-hour's distance away, looking for spring mushrooms like morels, edible shoots of asparagus, hops, or even young hazel shoots. But summer brings with it the plants that would lead to the true revolution of the year, the cereals. Summer, like spring, offers plenty of variety, but generally less nutrition. There are wild pears, wild strawberries, mulberries, junipers, green seeds like bird's-foot trefoil, and legumes such as the ancestors of chickpeas, lentils, and peas, etc. But the most important plants that provide the most calories for the season are, a ding ding ding, the wild grasses. These are your ancestors of einkorn, emmer, barley, oats, and rye. These grasses required rather heavy, consistent work, but yielded high returns. Not quite as high as autumn's hazelnut harvest, but still very worthwhile. They were cut with bone or flint sickles, threshed in pits or against poles while on site, then winnowed in the outdoor wind, before being finally hauled back to the base camp in order to be toasted. If the fields and valleys where they grew were far, it was worth the group's while to split and have the harvesters stay with the grains to finish the work, rather than to travel back and forth. And that would mark out the cycle of the year for our hunter-gatherers and our little caveman, keeping themselves fed and satisfied all year round. Not a bad way to live, huh? Now, when I started working on this video, I wanted to be way more precise in our explanations, listing out each shoot and root and edible leaf a group could possibly come across, including monthly cycles and harvest windows. But as we worked on the script, that goal became increasingly ridiculous. Vincent and I agree that it's far more interesting to instead have the focus of this video be on the mechanisms of foraging, to the best that we understand it, using a group in an environment heavily reliant on plant foods. A group of humans settle in a place and gather what is around them, not randomly, but with a criteria in mind that changes over time and with the environment. And we as writers, should we feel the need to pursue the concept of foraging, must then choose not only the environment and its resources, but also their abundance, their ease of access, and their predictability. And then, using all this research, planning, and knowledge I've gained over all this time, I can finally make that video on the food of a mortal. Coming soon. Well, given my upload schedule, it's not gonna be that soon. Anyway, bye! Thank you very much for watching. This video has been a slow process. Definitely not because I've been working on like 3 other things in the background for while working on this. That would be ridiculous. Why would you assume? I have more in the works that will hopefully be coming out a little bit more quicker than the space between this video and the last video. I feel like I say that at the end of every video and then it almost never comes true. But otherwise, I hope you guys enjoy this. This video is a little bit more similar to the lithic video in that it's more dealing with real history and real practices from nomadic and hunter-gatherer groups in the Paleolithic, and less about, you know, the fiction and the writing. Because I do like making these videos from time to time. They're a lot more research heavy, and I have to huge shout out to Vincent because he really pulls the most weight in these types of videos. So I do really appreciate his help and his work and everything that comes out on this channel. So yeah, thank you very much for watching. I hope you have an absolutely fantastic rest of your day. And yeah, if you are interested, I have a Patreon. You can see it's being advertised right now. I'm super grateful for everyone who is on it currently. If you would like to look at it and see what's available, what an option is, there's a lot of tiers, there's a lot of benefits for those tiers. Select whichever one takes your fancy, if any do at all. And I am grateful for any attention that you give it, any attention that you give this channel. Thank you very much. I shall take my leave now. Bye bye.